Good afternoon and morning, Dom. Great to have you back and to be speaking with you again. Obviously, it's been a very, very exciting week in particularly the US. We had the Fed, we've just had NFPs. So do you want to start by just sort of giving us a quick overview of the Fed and the recent data, and we can get into next week?
Sure. Nice to chat again. So on the Fed, yeah, I was surprised it was more hawkish than I thought. And this made me change my view. My view coming into the meeting was that we would be on a pause throughout the summer. But Chair Powell's assessment of the banking instability makes me think there is now a good chance of a 25 basis point hike in June, provided either the debt ceiling crisis has been resolved or it's been postponed. So two reasons for the change of view. First, I completely share Powell's assessment that the banking instability is a credit crunch, not a systemic banking crisis. I think the market is deeply mistaken, in part because the memories of the GFC are still very fresh. But this is definitely not a crisis where all the banks, all the borrowers have negative equity, and we have to go through a wholesale economy-wide restructuring of debt. What this is a crisis where regional lenders are being gobbled up by bigger banks. So what we have is a bout of consolidation, and for sure, that's going to weaken credit availability, especially for SMEs that are very reliant on smaller banks. And that's something that Chair Powell acknowledged during the presser. On the other hand, we are at a stage of the business cycle where borrowers need less credit. Basically, the time when people and businesses borrow is when there is a recession, because that's when they have a shortfall in income. But once income normalizes, they repay their debt simply because they can't, unlike the government, we, ordinary people and businesses, we can't pile up debt forever. So at this stage, typically, credit demand weakens, and that's what the data shows. So the impact of a likely credit crunch on growth is very uncertain. And at the same time, you have strong evidence of, sticky inflation, strong growth. Perhaps I can discuss that next.
Yeah,
but with the Fed, so if we don't have debt ceiling instability, there is every reason, in my view, for them to hike next month.
Yeah. And in terms of the, just to cover off the NFPs today, obviously there was a pretty decent headline number, but also a decent negative revision to the March number. Could you just talk us through just how hawkish all the detail was, and whether this sort of, I guess, adds more conviction to your view for potentially more hikes ahead?
Absolutely. So the really hawkish part was a 50 basis point month-on-month increase in nominal wages. I'd been waiting for that for quite some time, and I think it was delayed by special factors, such as, during the pandemic, because there was such an extreme shortage of workers, firms relied a lot on overtime. With the shortage of workers disappearing, use of overtime has normalized, which depressed wages, average wages, since overtime is paid more. But I think this is behind us, and now we're starting to see the real impact of an overheating labor market. So to come back to your point about the huge revision, for sure that data is a super volatile. And if there is an illustration of why you should not put too much emphasis on a single data point, that's it. But if you look at the big picture is still a big excess of labor demand over labor supply, and that's why the unemployment rate is the lowest since the 1950s. And when the labor market is as overheated as it is now, wages increase. And when wages increase, inflation accelerates. So I think this is very, very hawkish.
Yeah. And so just for context, has the Fed been very explicit in terms of what they're kind of baking into their assumptions for wage growth? Or have they been relatively sort of mean reverting, I guess, in their expectations?
So they are very focused on a component of inflation called core services, with excluding housing, which they see as really the key driver. And it's not really slowing. And it tends to be quite heavily influenced by wages. So this print today is going to give the Fed a pause, especially since real wages and the share of labor in national income have been rising. So, John Tierney has been talking about how margin behaviors, how firms still have a lot of pricing power. In my view, this is setting us up for an acceleration of inflation in the second half of the year. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if the Fed felt the same way about those numbers.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess that brings us on nicely in terms of to this week's data, or the week ahead's data, where we've got the CPI numbers coming out. Could you just talk us around what your expectations are for that, and sort of what you'd be, sort of what could come on the surprising side, I suppose?
So I'm going to stick my head above the parapet. I think there's likely to be a surprise, a 10 basis point surprise. Essentially, what's been driving disinflation, core disinflation, has been core goods and specifically used car prices. But you saw last month that the deflation in used car prices has started to ease. And historically, used car prices have tended to follow quite closely the Mannheim auction, the Mannheim used car auction prices. And so there is a good chance that this time around, used car prices could turn positive, and then that's going to lift the whole, core goods, and then the rest, and with the rest of the inflation component, I don't think are likely to come down.
Yeah.
Certainly not core services, excluding shelter, with the wage growth we are seeing, and shelter. I keep asking people to show me where they see the slowdown in rents, because I keep looking around Los Angeles. Guaranteed, it's not happening here. So if you where rents are going down, I want to know, and you should let me know.
Absolutely. And in terms of that number, is there, I suppose, if it was a big surprise on the downside, would that cause you to change your view, or would you not tie too much on a single data point? And I guess on the other side, right now the market's not really pricing very much in the near term, and then coming to sort of cuts on the Fed. Do you think a big beat, or the kind of beat, even 10 basis points that you're kind of looking for, could change that sort of pricing or change that view from the market?
So the first question on would a negative surprise change my view? It would certainly make me reassess my view. I mean, when the data changes, I change my view. Now, as we've discussed, the data is very volatile. One single print needs to be put in context. I would want to understand why there is a shortfall. On the second question, I think the market is so convinced that we are in for a repeat of 2008. In fact, I heard these very comments this morning. I think it will take much more than a 10 basis point surprise in a month-on-month CPI.
I suppose it, and also sort of NFP sort of building the picture, at least, so maybe come at some point.
I think what we are going to need is a few months of stability with banks, increasing in continued increases in lending. The loans are not falling. Also, one survey that people tend to look at is a small business survey that's out on Monday or Tuesday, and has some question on credit availability. I think it's out on Tuesday.
Yeah.
We need several of those. We need the SLUs. So for uninformed readers, this horrible acronym means something like Senior Loan Officer Opinion Survey. So basically asking about credit standards and demand for credits. And we have it's a quarterly report. It comes out, I believe, on Monday. And I believe it's going to show exactly the same thing as the previous one that was published in January, namely that credit standards are tightening, which is typically what happens when the Fed hikes. So credit standards have been tightening for a year, and the demand for credit is falling, which is, consistent with my macro view. So no surprise here. I think it's just going to be a case of, the market fears being disproved by the data again and again and again. And at some point over the summer, maybe people will throw in the towel. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely in terms of the sort of credit conditions and lending, that's certainly what we've seen at in Europe at least. So Lagarde definitely put a lot more emphasis on the sort of bank lending survey and the tightening there than I would have expected, given that it's very much married with a tightening cycle. But yeah, no, that'd be interesting to watch. And then coming on to, so obviously the budget and the debt ceiling and X date is pretty it's been high interest amongst clients, etc. I know from you. So we get some more information out on next Friday, right, from the CBO. Could you just talk us through what that is and what expectations around that are and how it could affect particularly the Fed view?
So basically, we are getting to what happened is that there was a catastrophic and unanticipated decline in non-withheld tax receipts. And again, for listeners not familiar with all the jargon around this whole debt ceiling business, the majority of tax revenue in the US is personal income tax, and it's withheld when people get paid. So automatically, when you get your paycheck, a share of it goes to the US Treasury. But there is a share of tax revenue that's not withheld and paid, and it's typically paid in April, because this is when we Americans have our big tax day. And this year, it turned out to be very disappointing. And actually not so much due to an unanticipated economic slowdown or unanticipated decline in income, but because of extreme climate event in California, where Californians were granted a reprieve to file and pay their taxes. And that's the reason why the decline has been so surprising. So that decline has increased the risk that the government could run out of cash in early June, perhaps the 1st of June, even though by the end of June, there is a big pot of additional room for issuing debt, about 140 billion, that becomes available at the end of June. This is the complexity of the whole thing is insane and so unnecessary, such an inefficient process. So either we get through the beginning of June without crisis, and then we're likely to have the X day postponed to probably July, or early July, the Treasury Secretary, throws in the towel and says no more cash, and then we have to get resolution.
Yeah, and you've mentioned previously around how the brinkmanship would suggest that something needs to sort of at least look like it's going to break before one side gives in. Is there any sort of areas that you think would be potentially the focus in on that front, or?
Oh, so that's the paradox of this whole thing, is that the administration has decided to play hardball. They have refused to negotiate. There is a meeting between President Biden and senior congressional leaders on the 9th, which is Tuesday, and I doubt anything will come out of it. So for brinkmanship to work, you need one side or the other to get so scared that they concede. And one way of, getting people really scared is to have large market volatility, as we had during the GFC with the TARP, when the administration requested an enormous amount of money from Congress, no strings attached, and Congress said no, and then the market sold off the following day by 15%. So we need to have that sort of a gigantic market volatility to get to resolution. The problem is, because we all know that in the end, the US is not going to go the way of Russia and declares that it will pay only 50% of its debt. So we know in the long run, this will be resolved. It's very difficult to have the volatility we would need for resolution. Yeah. So we need to get very close, or maybe to the day, to the X day, and maybe have a real technical default for things to start moving.
So that could be a very decent sort of fat tail, big risk event then potentially on the horizon.
Definitely.
Okay, no, absolutely. No, great to hear your thoughts on that, and always useful and interesting to hear your thoughts in general. Is there anything else sort of that's sort of catching your eye in the next week, or that people should be keeping an eye out for?
I mean, these are the main one. We also have the University of Michigan consumer survey. The consensus is no change. I agree. I mean, if it turns out to be a disappointment, it's likely to reflect consumer perception of inflation, since that survey, compared with the Conference Board consumer survey, the University of Michigan is more sensitive to perceptions of inflation. So that would be interesting. The monthly business budget statement on Wednesday will be the deficit for April, and we may get more color on the sources of the shortfall in revenues, but that should be covered by the CBO on Friday. So I think this is a gist of it. There could be decent volatility around the CPI if my views are correct.
Oh, always good to hear. No, and great precedence on your views. So I'll just sort of, as we usually do, or Andrew usually does, just tick off a few of the pieces that we put out recently for our clients to sort of pay attention to and have a check out on the website. So, I mean, for those of them who've been following, Blal's obviously been putting out quite a few sort of views on euro, particularly euro dollar. So he's got a new piece with looking at tactical short position in euro dollar, which runs through a few different reasons why that could sort of pan out, including on the sort of bank jitter side. So please check that out. We've obviously got Dom's Fed review and why you now see the Fed continuing to hike when you didn't previously. We've got a oil weekly, which is particularly relevant given the recent price decline. And a lot of questions around and why that is and how it's going to sort of turn out. And then we've also got my ECB review and why I think it's going to be, well, it didn't hike 50 basis points like I'd sort of been looking for. The path's quite set for them to have to continue hiking and more than at least the market's pricing right now. So that's it. Thank you once again for joining us and speaking with us. It's always a pleasure. Hope you have a fine rest of the day and enjoy your lovely weather.
Thank you, Henry. I hope you enjoy the coronation. What will you be doing?
Oh, we'll be out celebrating, of course, in the rain. Trying to stay sensible, but yeah.
Always a good thing to do. Take care and good luck to all our listeners.